Okay, so we welcome colleagues from around the world, including UK. We've got England, Scotland, and Wales, and we've got colleagues from Ireland and from Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and we have those also from China. I'm sorry if I have missed out on anybody that's from the registrations. So I'm delighted to welcome Professor Lisa Taylor of the University of East Anglia in the UK, who will share with us her talk entitled The Pedagogical Potential of Work-Based Learning Placements, a Missing Link Between Theory and Practice for Employability Within Higher Education. So over to you, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Martina. Apologies for the technological problems. We're all logged in and ready to go, and then suddenly my sound went on my laptop. So thank you, Martina, for sharing your screen at your end. Welcome to everybody, whatever time of day it is for you all. I'm really excited to share this presentation with you this morning and have the discussion afterwards. Next slide, please. I would just like to acknowledge and thank Professor Gilly Salmon. I've worked in partnership with Gilly over the last 3 years to develop and share the peer-enhanced e-placement model, which I will be referring to during this presentation, and really provided the bedrock for the content of this presentation that really then enabled me to write the book. Around online work-based learning opportunities. I'd also like to thank those individual teams who have adopted the PEEP and continue to champion the PEEP model throughout the UK and beyond. Next slide, please. So I've been involved in employability leadership for the last 10 years. I started as a Director of Employability within the School of Health Sciences, and I've been Associate Dean for Employability for the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at the University of East Anglia for the last few years. And I've seen really employability change over those last 10 years from very much looking at definitions of what is meant by employability. So I would go to conferences and the whole conference would be talking about what is meant by employability. It's then moved on to embedding employability within the curriculum. And that's very much more like at a course level. And it's now moved on more recently to look at capital and agency. So looking at employability very much at an individual level. So there's been a real evolution of employability over the last 10 years that I've sort of witnessed in my leadership responsibilities. But now employability really has become one of the critical priorities within the higher education landscape, not only within the UK, but across the world. And you'll see within the literature, there's more and more being written about employability and around the metrics contributing to teaching and learning as well. Employability is getting a seat at the table where 10 years ago it wasn't necessarily doing so. Next slide, please. There are lots of different aspects to employability, but one of the main aspects of employability that I'm going to be talking about during this presentation is around the work-based learning placements. And it's one of the most common activities to support employability. That was found in a recent piece of research that was undertaken by the Association of Graduate Careers Advisors Services and Shortlist Me. And work-based learning really offers authentic learning and an opportunity to develop life-wide employability learning beyond the classroom. I think sometimes there can be a theory-practice disconnect between what people are saying employability is and how students can translate that into themselves as individuals. And work-based learning really offers that bridge between what they're learning in the curriculum, what they're learning about themselves, and how that can be translated into the workplace. I think in the past, work-based learning can be seen as an inferior add-on to the academic curriculum, can have been seen as a bit of a tick box exercise. People might do a year-long placement, but how well has that been sort of analysed and quality assured, and having specific learning outcomes assigned to those to really help those individuals understand what they're learning about themselves as well as what they're learning about perhaps the content or skills, what are they learning employability wise beyond professional skills and knowledge, which they do learn within the curriculum anyway. And I think sometimes that perceived lack of pedagogical design and delivery that is normally expected as part of the academic curriculum can sometimes mean that work-based learning doesn't necessarily get the attention or the design that it otherwise could to really support a quality employability experience for students to really develop their individual employability and their agency over their employability as well. It's very much about students having their ownership and agency and that awareness of the capital that they're needing to develop and using those work-based learning opportunities to really maximise that. There is a theory-practice link for employability that has been demonstrated through a case exemplar. So this is the peer-enhanced e-placement that I'll go through in a little bit more detail later on. Next slide, please, Martina. I was asked to develop a document that was put on a website for Health Education England, which is now NHS England, is changed and merged with NHS England. And I developed what I called an employability roadmap for work-based learning placements. And you'll see along this road, there's lots of signposts, and those signposts are listed on the left-hand side. Now, this was an employability roadmap for work-based learning within health and social care subjects. But all of these elements are relevant for any subjects across the higher education landscape. But what you'll see is only one of those signposts are clinical and professional skills and knowledge. All of the other signposts are around wider employability attributes, and I call them resources. So employability resources that individuals need to draw upon when it comes to them transitioning into the workplace, and something they need to be working on a lot all the way through their degree programs in order to really be ready at the point of graduation to know who they are, what they've got to offer, and what they want to offer the wider workplace and society as well. So this just really reinforces what work-based learning placements can offer students beyond knowledge and skills, those wider employability resources that really makes it an important aspect of any student's journey throughout higher education. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about work-based learning, as I said, perhaps traditionally students have been sent on a placement, hasn't necessarily been designed as such. But I think what I'd like to go through during this presentation is some of those design and delivery considerations that would really help make that pedagogical link between the academic curriculum and the workplace, and perhaps ensure quality learning for students in a way that perhaps isn't always achieved through placements as things stand. So what you're really wanting to consider when you're designing and delivering work-based learnings is that there are clear outcomes. You're wanting a clear purpose so that students and employers and academics who are help organising the placements with the students and the employers have a clear purpose. They've got a clear understanding of what it is they're wanting to achieve from the work-based learning. This means they've got a clear direction as to where they're going. Everybody knows what's happening, so everybody can work together to achieve that. You want to scaffold the learning. Things don't necessarily happen by accident. There are happy accidents that happen, happy accidental learning, but also you want to really scaffold that learning. So you're building the learning during the placement and developing that individual during the placement experience. You want to consider how you're going to facilitate engagement in the learning so the students don't just turn up at the beginning of the day, go away at the end of the day and just do what they need to do. How are they going to have that authentic engagement in their learning? What are the clear roles and responsibilities? Whose role is what? Who's got responsibility for what? What are the academics needing to do from the higher education point of view? What are the employers needing to do? And what are the students' responsibilities and roles as well? This just makes things absolutely clear what expectations there are and really maximise that journey of learning for the students. Relationships are absolutely key. We all know the benefits of networking, the benefits of relationship building, and relationship building is a key aspect of employability, that ability to work with people, build relations, and recognising that within the work-based learning opportunity for students for them to build their social capital is absolutely valuable. You're also wanting to support cognitive and social constructivism, which really underpins that agency for students and their ownership of their employability, and also really supports metacognition for individuals. So not just knowing what they've learned, but how they've learned it and how they're going to take that learning forwards to future academic learning or work-based learning or their workplace upon graduation. What's crucial all along the way is making sure that you apply universal design for learning principles, which I'll put a link there for those who might want to look at that in more detail, but making sure that things are accessible for everybody involved is crucial. Next slide, please. So when we're then thinking about learning outcomes and those shared purpose and the purpose of work-based learning for individuals, the learning outcomes, I call them anchors, because if we're talking about innovation, and I'm going to talk about a workplace learning innovation later on during this presentation, I was very clear that I needed these anchors to make sure that you've got that to keep you grounded as to what the ultimate end goal is for that innovation that you are implementing. And the learning outcomes are the anchors for that, to make sure that you've got that in mind and everything is built around that to ensure that pedagogical journey for the students. Learning outcomes help to link the academic curriculum with the work-based learning. You can see where there may be gaps in the curriculum or things that you want to reinforce that has been learned through the curriculum within the work-based learning context. It provides that common and clear purpose. We were talking about what the expectations were. Those learning outcomes are things that are written down that make it absolutely clear what that common and clear purpose are for everybody involved in that work-based learning. It's interpersonal and intrapersonal characteristics to support employability and graduate readiness. So it's not just about knowledge, it's being aware of all of those other employability attributes and resources that you're wanting the students to be developing, and to make those explicit so that students are maximising making opportunities and taking opportunities during their work-based learning opportunities to develop those interpersonal and intrapersonal characteristics and resources. What you can also consider around learning outcomes is having individual learning contracts, where students may be working along the general learning outcomes that students may be working at as a cohort in their work-based learning experiences, but also have individual goals within learning contracts that they're wanting to really look at an individual level. And it's been shown in the literature that if people have common purposes as well as individual purposes, that really can help with engagement. What you really want to be thinking about with your learning outcomes as well is developing relevant and authentic employability resources, something that has meaning for your individual students and something that has meaning for the students when they come to graduation. And that's where working with employers comes into play, in making sure that there is that link, authentic link between curriculum and practice. What you also need to do is make sure that those learning outcomes help to inform assessment design and offer the route for the learning journey. So your assessments that may be linked to work-based learning, use those learning outcomes to help inform that assessment design. And if you've got authentic learning outcomes, then it's going to help with authentic assessment design as well. And making sure they're formative as well as summative assessments as well, which I'll go through later. Next slide, please. So assessment and feedback are linked, but there are distinct differences. Winstone and Bowd have published widely around assessment and feedback, and talking about all of the literacies around assessments and feedback, but making sure that there is that sort of distinct difference really between what you're doing for assessment and having a feedback process that is separate to that. You do need to make sure that you have that consideration of assessment literacy, particularly if you're working with employers within the work-based learning context, making sure that those employers who may be involved in that assessment process have that literacy, have that understanding of what the assessment is about, how to implement the assessment, etc. as well. Make sure you have those formative assessments. I always think of the formative as the journey and then the summative, the destination for the learning. And very much that formative is assessing and helping the continuous learning for the students. And then the summative, assessing of that learning journey at the destination that you're wanting them to get to, when you're seeing have they achieved those learning outcomes or not. What you're really wanting to make sure is that you have authentic assessments supporting progress towards the learning outcome. So depending where those work-based learning opportunities are for the individuals, making sure that they are authentic assessments. And within the work-based learning environment, it's a lot easier actually to get very authentic assessments that are very relevant to the work-based context when the students are within that environment. Next slide, please. So feedback impacts significantly on learning. It's shown within the literature that it does impact significantly, but it has been reported as one of the least positive aspects of courses. There's a recognition that feedback is complex and it can be difficult to manage across work-based placement teams. And I think this is where organisation and making sure that there's clear direction and clear instruction and clear preparation for any work-based learning to be really rigorously designed is crucial to maximise all of these different pedagogical components for students. Winstone talks around awareness of feedback, cognizance around feedback, agency, and a lack of volition and readiness, and talking about all of those elements that are required in order to maximise the feedback potential within work-based learning. So it's making sure that everybody's aware of what feedback mechanisms there are and how that feedback's going to be delivered, how to engage in the feedback, how to respond to the feedback, and making sure everybody's involved with that. Giving students agency within their feedback. It's not just a one-way road, that students should be able to respond, etc. as well. And making sure that everybody's ready to really maximise that feedback process. Henderson talks about capacity for feedback, making sure that there is feedback designed into the process, and also making sure that there's a culture and an appetite for feedback. In order to maximise and engage with feedback, there needs to be a culture of acceptance and engagement with feedback from all parties. So that's employer, students and academics. Make sure that that feedback is authentic. Think about modes and methods. There's lots of different ways of providing feedback. It doesn't always have to be written. Dialogue feedback is found to be a really effective mode of feedback. And certainly within the workplace context, if you think about when we would get feedback, it would be within a conversation with those who we're working with. And so preparing students and developing feedback that is authentic to the context within their working is crucial as well. So just as I said with assessment, having that literacy, feedback literacy is crucial as well, and needs to be aligned between all stakeholders. Joanna Tai has done an incredible amount of work around feedback literacy and making sure that everybody is aware of what the feedback is for, making sure that the feedback is appropriate, and making sure that everybody's prepared and providing that authentic feedback to ensure that those the process of feedback is not just a tick box exercise, that it's something authentic and meaningful for those involved, and can really help the learning for the students, which is ultimately the ultimate aim for any work-based learning opportunity. Next slide, please. Supervision is important as well. And just like feedback, it does need to be a two-way process. It's not about the supervisor telling the student what to do. In order to develop that agency and confidence and self-efficacy is a crucial part of learning for students, having that confidence in themselves, their own learning, but also having the confidence to question others and develop their learning through that discussion and the two-way process of supervision with their supervisor as well. This can be helped with agreed principles of supervision, so having that supervision contract. Who's responsible for what? Who needs to bring what to those supervision sessions? What paperwork is going to be used to help to formulate those discussions and to record those discussions, so students have got that opportunity to go back to those notes or recordings of discussions to help with their reflection and metacognition of their learning, but also a bit of a line in the sand at that point of time. Where were you and how have you moved on from that? Supervision should be very much a guiding hand towards learning outcomes rather than being told what to do. It's a guiding hand to support the learning for the students rather than them being told what to do by a supervisor and student going away and doing it and coming back. You're wanting really to facilitate that student agency, student development of learning, student development of their employability and their various capitals, and given that autonomy to do that and confidence to do that, to build their self-efficacy. If you find that you've got groups of students going out to the same organisation, it may well be that you could have group supervision, which can be really, really positive. Students can interrogate and question each other in different ways than they would perhaps with their supervisor, but do be mindful of the drawbacks of group dynamics. But also, as I said, the benefits of that team building and reduced reliance on the supervisor. So group supervision can be used really positively as well, but be mindful of the positive things as well as some of those drawbacks. Next slide, please. So I've just alluded to reflection. Reflection is a crucial part of any learning for students. I don't think we often give it enough time within the academic environment, and within a busy work environment, that can be even more difficult. So this is where the design and delivery really comes in the fact that you want to design and make sure within that delivery that there is time for reflection. It's essential to support consolidation of learning, but also that metacognition, that opportunity to think, I've learnt that, how have I learnt it, and how is that going to influence me moving forward? It really does assist with the theory practice link, the opportunity for students to take what they're learning within the workplace learning environment, looking about what they've learned within the academic curriculum and starting to make those links for themselves. It's crucial to support lifelong employability journey. Employability doesn't stop at the point of graduation. We're all on our own employability journeys, whatever stage of our careers that we're at, and I'm sure we perhaps not always aware of it, but we reflect on our own situation, our own learning experiences, even now it has experienced individuals within higher education, to support our lifelong employability journey ourselves. And there's skills that students really need to learn during their higher education experience to then take with them into the workplace when they graduate. It does help identify learning needs. So by reflecting, putting the mirror in front of ourselves or magnifying certain parts that otherwise we might not necessarily notice, what it does is highlights areas that we may well need to look at in more detail. So giving students the opportunity to reflect and identify perhaps things that might have gone by the by may help them with their breadth and depth of learning. Different models and frameworks exist around reflection, lots and lots of models around reflection, lots of literature around reflection. So you can think about which perhaps are the best ways, best models for students to use that best suit the workplace context that they're going to be in. Portfolios are really useful, and sort of having the portfolios designed with reflective questions that are going to help the students reflect on their learning, that's helping them work towards their learning outcomes, are useful as well for the students to have everything building together and evidence as they're learning. Rehearsal of employability learning is a key thing for students to be able to do. Students can have a bulging CV, but if they're not able to articulate their learning and what they've learnt and perhaps what they're needing to develop in themselves when it comes to the point of employment and applying for jobs, then a bulging CV is useless for them, quite frankly. So portfolios is offering them the opportunity to evidence their learning and rehearse some of that, so that they've already got those sort of sound bites in their head of what they've learnt, what they've got existing that they perhaps need to work more on, that then becomes very crucial when they're then actually applying for employment. So this is that sort of employability lifelong journey with employment destinations along the way, and it's continually developing yourself throughout, but being ready at any point where an employment opportunity comes in to draw upon the evidence that you're generating for yourself to be able to offer that at the point of need. Next slide, please. So I've talked about all the key pedagogical principles that we need to consider when thinking about work-based learning opportunities that perhaps might be that missing link between the theory and practice, between the academic and the employment aspect and then employment context. And what I'm going to share with you now is a case exemplar where all of this pedagogical process has been put into practice and has been shown to be a really valuable learning opportunity for students. Now, the Peer Enhanced E-Placement, PEEP, I created the PEEP at the height of the pandemic. All of our students within our courses, within the School of Health Sciences, have mandatory placement experiences that they have to complete in order to graduate within their respective professions. My background is in occupational therapy, and our occupational therapy students needed a placement. We didn't have access to our usual placement partners because they were busy dealing with COVID, weren't necessarily delivering their usual services. They were being redeployed into other areas to just help with everything that was going on. So I created the Peer Enhanced E-Placement, which was one of the first online work-based learning placements that was developed and evaluated for health professions. And since then, myself and Professor Gilly Salmon has worked together to develop the PEEP into what is now a widely accepted model across multiple professions. So it was delivered entirely online using peer group pedagogy. A real pivot was needed in that appreciation of the learning that could be achieved online within professions that are predominantly renowned to have practical, hands-on placements, and very much on a one-to-one basis with their supervisor and student, whereas this was very much entirely online and using peer group pedagogy. It was designed using the usual placement learning outcomes. So I made sure that I used as much as the usual pedagogical processes for the students as possible as my anchors. This was something that was innovative, but knowing that we needed that quality assurance, our programs are validated around these professional standards, and the placement learning outcomes are based on those professional standards. So those still needed to be achieved through this different mode of placement delivery. So it did fulfil statutory and professional body guidelines. There was an extensive induction period for the students because this was something quite different. I had 10 days to create the PEEP. So there wasn't the time within that process that you would normally get to prepare students and those involved within the PEEP to be able to be fully inducted. So there was a very clear induction process, which actually has remained since that initial PEEP, because it was very important for this different way of delivering placements. Clear roles and responsibilities were outlined at the beginning. The student responsibility, both within the peer group, but also the supervision differences needed to be
I shall accept.
Needed to be made clear as well. And then there was that clear shared purpose and learning outcomes for the placement as well. So everybody had their general learning outcomes that they were all working towards, which helped their engagement because they all wanted to pass their placement. But we also had learning contracts where students could have individual learning goals that they're working alongside those clear shared purpose as well. Students worked with and took responsibility for a caseload as they would have ordinarily done in the workplace scenario. And also I developed an e-workbook, which was the equivalence of their portfolio, which had all of the evidence that they could generate for their reflections, but also all of the information around the PEEP was in that, so that they had everything to refer to. Next slide, please. So these were the clear roles and responsibilities required. There needed to be a PEEP local lead who coordinated everything. Students had that responsibility from an individual and peer group point of view. There were long-arm supervisors who monitored students and provided feedback and guidance throughout. And then for each element of the PEEP, so for each case study or scenario, there was a project lead who would lead that particular element. Next slide, please. So thinking about the online delivery, that pedagogical underpinning, meaningful online learning is possible. Professor Julie Salmon has published for years about how online learning can be meaningful. It can offer that equivalence of learning. In fact, it can offer greater learning. We found that within the PEEP, there has been greater learning in particular areas as compared that could be possible within the face-to-face environment. It offers learning in complex and high-pressure situations that are not always possible in the real world. It offers an opportunity to combine human teaching and technology to facilitate active, engaged online learning. The PEEP was very much underpinned by the application of Julie's 5 stages of learning, which is widely accepted across the world. And it just reinforces really that work-based learning goes beyond hands-on, in-person, in situ, clinical professional skills, and that can be applied more widely across the higher education landscape as well, in the fact that work-based learning isn't just about hands-on, face-to-face skills and knowledge. It's about a lot more than that can be achieved through something like the PEEP. Next slide, please. So thinking about the peer group pedagogical evidence base. The next slide, please. It's not just about bringing groups of students together. It's about encouraging that social interaction to support student learning. Having those common and individual goals really maximises the learning journeys, and it provides a rich learning opportunities within the peer groups to get in-depth professional reasoning and critical reasoning, which is something that is always ranked very highly within employers that they're needing from graduates, but is only now being realised within clinical education. Next slide, please. What it does offer is in-depth learning, preparing for the clinical world of work. It uses observation of peers, which can support more in-depth learning. So within the PEEP, certain peer groups will lead sessions with the rest of the cohort listening in. And students have reported time and time again how valuable that is to be able to observe their peers and then work in their peer groups to discuss and critically analyse what has been done and what hasn't been done to really help with that metacognition and consolidation of their learning. It's really helped with enhancing their communication, collaboration, and that critical reflection. And what has been found is equivalent and quality learning gains, but also helping with work-based learning placement capacity challenges. We have placement capacity challenges across the piece within health and social care, and I know within the wider higher education landscape that work-based learning can be quite tricky to set up because of availability of work-based learning opportunities. But there is the opportunity within something like the PEEP to maximise placement capacity by whole cohorts being on a placement at one time, perhaps working with a number of employers who have just individual responsibility for a proportion of the placement, whilst supporting quality learning gains for those students. Next slide, please. So talking about that structure and scaffolding that I talked about earlier, about those pedagogical processes, there is peer synchronous learning, there is assessment, both formative and summative. We have scaffolding of learning, there's group and individual supervision using different modes. There's an opportunity for individual reflection, there's feedback, both group and individual with different modes. And there's individual asynchronous preparation, peer group reflection, and pacing as well. And this is all designed within the PEEP timetable to ensure there's that pedagogical process for the students. Next slide, please. So within the PEEP, you've got three main areas. Next, thank you. So you've got professional standards and the specific placement learning outcomes, the anchors. You've then got those PEEP pedagogical principles and the timetable design for the work-based learning process. And then you've got your online work-based learning placement environment using a virtual learning environment or the learning management system or other platforms such as Microsoft Teams, etc. So it's not anything that needs any complex technology. What's the most complex thing is making sure that you design and deliver it in a robust pedagogical way using those principles that I've outlined. As soon as we've had really positive, next slide please, as soon as we'd had really positive response from the initial PEEP, Gillian and I realised that we were perhaps onto something and wanted to make sure that we scaled up the PEEP. And we developed what's called the PEEP acquisition experience, which is a three-stage process for placement teams to work together to be able to develop, design and deliver their own PEEPs. So there's pre-work, where we make sure that individuals are clear about those professional standards and the key pedagogical components. They bring those to the half-day online workshop that Gillian and I lead, where we look at exemplar student timetables, look at the rigour of the pedagogical process of a PEEP, to then enable those placement teams to customise their own professional local course needs within that framework. And then there's a follow-up to quality assure that process. And then those individuals are given the handbook to design their own as well. Next slide, please. So over the last 3 years, we have worked with over 80 work-based place learning teams across the UK, in New Zealand and Kenya. That spans over 20 professions or fields. And so far we know of, and we know there's a lot more that we haven't heard about, over 1,800 UK students have completed a PEEP. And we've got examples across lots and lots of health and social care professions that you can see listed there. And the PEEP model has now been developed to involve live links into the workplace and has been shown to have flexibility for adaptation and adoption across professions that have been predominantly, historically, very hands-on in their placement provision, but the PEEP has shown how other elements of placement learning and employability resources can really be maximised through that online delivery. Next slide, please. So what we've done is carried out our own PEEP research. Lots of other people have carried out their own individual evaluations that have found very similar things as well. So we've conducted an online survey with those people who've completed their PEEPs, looked at the experience of the PEEP acquisition experience and their contextualisation of PEEP for their own students. And then we had evaluative interviews as well to explore some of those themes in more depth. Next slide, please. This was carried out by an independent research assistant, nothing to do with PEEP, so she had no understanding of the PEEP, so it was completely conducted independently. The qualitative data was analysed using NVivo, and quantitative data was collated and analysed descriptively. Next slide, please. So the main key findings of the quantitative data was that the PEEP acquisition experience impacted on understanding for online placements and the PEEP design. It impacted on the value of peer learning. And then individuals, once they'd had and tried and tested the PEEP as an innovation, they then had confidence to look at other wider innovations as well. Most people were planning one PEEP during their programme of study, and mostly working with second years and looking at sort of 3-week PEEPs. But some have done 6-week PEEPs very successfully as well, but mostly 3 to 4 weeks. Next slide, please. The key learning from the qualitative data was that PEEP had a wide range of benefits. It was a very positive and successful experience. Students were able to meet their placement learning outcomes and had added values around the teamwork element with the peer groups, that in-depth critical and professional reasoning. You were able to design content, look at gaps where you knew there were gaps in placement learning or gaps in the curriculum that you really wanted to apply within that placement environment. You're able to plan and design the PEEP around that content. The design of the PEEP is sustainable. Once you've designed it once, you can deliver it multiple times with minimal changes. And the flexible nature of the PEEP was one of its main strengths. The pedagogical design and components that I've talked through, those pedagogical principles, are key to have that journey supported for the students. But the content that you're putting in individually at a course level can be flexible for the students to achieve those learning outcomes that you're wanting them to achieve. But extra support and transformation was required from team students and practitioners to accept what could be achieved through a PEEP and to adopt what was quite a different style of placement learning, which I think is probably less of an obstacle now, because people are so much more widely experienced around things like telehealth or online learning, or lots of people working from home now. So that sort of hybrid working is much more acceptable now, and so less of a challenge than had previously been highlighted. Next slide, please. So the overall key recommendations is continuing to work with staff to help change mindset and get them prepared for placements such as the PEEP. It really does help with that collaboration between higher education institutes and placement providers, so provides that gap that is often highlighted between employers and higher education. Use that PEEP timetable to help underpin that pedagogy, which is absolutely key to ensure quality and robustness. Make sure that the organisation of the PEEP is resourced, and then design once and deliver multiple times and share resources for efficiencies longer term. Next slide, please. So why would you consider a PEEP or an online work-based learning experience such as the PEEP? It does offer sustainable mitigation against further disruption and work-based learning placement capacity challenges. It does appreciate those non-hands-on employability and professional development gains for students, but also staff. Staff said it was really useful for them to be involved in a much more sort of robustly designed, rather than just going with the flow type placement, help them with their understanding as well. So it helps with employers as well. It has that quality, robust design and evidence underpinning built around those learning outcome anchors. And we've shown that there's been local adaptation and adoption for local need with a breadth of learning opportunities. Next slide, please. So the PEEP has been adaptable and adopted by multiple professions with positive evaluation. It has generated work-based learning placement capacity, offers efficiency and accessibility for students, no travel and accommodation costs or time. It's a quality and sustainable evidence-based work-based learning placement model. It links that pedagogical theoretical principles to work-based learning practice that I've talked about at those early stages of this presentation. Those pedagogical theoretical principles have been applied within the PEEP, and you've seen that in practice. It's now included in higher education employability strategy development and was used as a case study in a National Council of Deans Health Strategy report, and has been part of an Erasmus Plus research project commissioned by the European Commission. Next slide, please. It has won a number of awards. I've written a book, The Constructing Online Work-Based Learning Placement, based on those pedagogical components of the PEEP, and the PEEP is a case study example within that. And we've published and presented widely over the last 3 years. Next slide, please. So here you'll see a list of references that have underpinned the presentation today that you can go and look at in more detail. The next slide, please. And here you can see a list of PEEP resources, videos and publications if you want to look at PEEP in more detail. And next slide, please. Thank you very much for listening, and very happy to answer any questions. Sorry, I can't see the chat on my phone, so Martina, I'm going to have to rely on you to ask me any questions, or anybody on the mic. Thank you.